Lisa Carter was never the type to be easily shaken. She grew up learning how to survive with little, shaped by a single mother who worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. When she met Mark at 22, she was drawn to his ambition, to the way he spoke about his dreams, with an almost naive confidence. He wanted to build his own business. She wanted a stable life, built with effort and partnership. For years, Lisa held everything together: 2 jobs, sleepless nights, bills always on the edge while Mark chased his big idea. When the business finally took off, she believed it had all been worth it. They were married, they had a house, a future carefully planned. But, as Lisa learned in the worst possible way, some people are only loyal as long as they need you. Now, sitting in a cold courtroom, the smell of old paper and expensive perfume filling the air, Lisa tried to keep her hands steady under the table. Across from her, Mark looked relaxed, as if he were watching a game whose score was already decided. He was wearing a suit she had picked out years ago, back when they were just a young couple trying to impress investors. But this time, sitting beside him, was Amanda, flawlessly styled blonde hair, a designer dress, and a look of superiority that made Lisa's stomach turn. Amanda wasn't just the mistress, she was the replacement. And in that moment, as the lawyers spoke, Lisa realized that Mark had planned everything. The house, under the company's name, the bank accounts, drained, the prenuptial agreement he had insisted she sign, ironclad. At least, that's what he thought. Lisa clenched her jaw as Mark's lawyer spoke with an air of rehearsed confidence, outlining the financial arrangements as if she were nothing more than a footnote in Mark's success story. Every word felt like a fresh betrayal. The house, the business, the investments, they were all tied up in ways that conveniently left her with nothing. She wasn't naive. She had known for months that Mark was slipping away, but she had underestimated how ruthless he could be. And now, as his attorney flipped through the thick stack of legal documents, detailing how the prenuptial agreement left her with barely enough for a few months' rent, Lisa felt the weight of 18 years reduced to a financial inconvenience. Amanda, sitting beside Mark, crossed her legs and tapped her manicured nails against the polished wooden table, a small smirk playing at her lips. Lisa's own lawyer, Daniel Brooks, remained silent, his expression unreadable. He had told her to trust him, to let him handle it. But as the walls seemed to close in, Lisa struggled to believe that anything could be done. She wasn't just losing a marriage, she was losing her home, her stability, her sense of security. Mark had stripped everything away, leaving her to start over with nothing. He didn't even look at her, too busy adjusting his cufflinks and nodding along with his lawyer's words. It was a performance, and Lisa was the discarded supporting actress. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, as the judge flipped through the documents. This was it, the end of everything she had built. And Mark, as always, had already moved on. Mark leaned back in his chair, exuding the arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. The courtroom felt stifling, the weight of injustice pressing down on Lisa's chest as her ex-husband played the role of the composed, successful businessman. He had calculated everything down to the way he would feign disappointment at the ruling before walking out hand in hand with Amanda, ready to continue his life as if Lisa had never existed. Lisa gripped the edge of the table, forcing herself to stay composed, even as anger simmered beneath her skin. She had sacrificed too much to be discarded like an outdated business expense. But as the judge prepared to speak, Daniel finally moved. With a measured breath, he slid a document forward. "Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice steady but firm, "before we finalize any division of assets, there's a legally binding financial document that changes the terms entirely." His words were casual, almost indifferent, but the shift in the room was immediate. Mark let out an exasperated sigh, shaking his head. "Oh, come on, Daniel," he scoffed. "There's nothing left to discuss. This is a waste of everyone's time." But Daniel remained unbothered, waiting as the judge adjusted her glasses and carefully read through the papers in front of her. Lisa held her breath, watching as the judge's eyes narrowed slightly. A flicker of something concern, recognition, disbelief crossed her face. And then, In a voice that sent a chill down Lisa's spine, the judge looked up and asked, "Mr. Carter, are you aware of the financial trust your late grandfather established for his family members?" Lisa's pulse pounded in her ears. The words felt like a foreign language at first, as if her brain refused to process them. Mark, however, had no such delay. His entire body tensed, his smug expression faltering for the first time that day. Amanda's fingers, which had been lazily tapping against the table, suddenly froze mid-air. There was something here, something Mark hadn't expected. Lisa's gaze darted between the judge and Daniel, searching for any sign of what was happening. Mark's lawyer, who had been effortlessly confident just moments ago, suddenly straightened, flipping through his own papers with an urgency that didn't match his previous composure. The air in the room thickened with an unspoken tension. Daniel continued, his voice calm but deliberate. "This trust explicitly states that any marital partner of a Carter family member is legally entitled to half of the estate in the event of a divorce unless they willingly forfeit their claim in a separate agreement." He turned the page, tapping a specific section with his pen. Mrs. Carter never signed such an agreement. Lisa felt the air rush from her lungs. She had spent the past several months preparing herself for loss, for walking away with nothing, for having to rebuild from the ground up. And now, with a single document, everything had changed. Mark's jaw clenched so tightly she thought his teeth might crack. The judge studied the paperwork in silence, then nodded once. "This changes everything," she said simply. Mark's reaction was immediate. His hand slammed onto the table, the controlled businessman facade cracking like thin ice over deep water. "This is a mistake," he growled, his voice low but sharp. His lawyer leaned in, whispering frantically, flipping through documents as if hoping to find an escape route buried in the fine print. But there was none. They had assumed Lisa was powerless. They had assumed wrong. Amanda, who had been so effortlessly confident just minutes ago, now sat frozen, her lips pressed into a thin, tense line. Lisa could almost hear the calculations running through her mind, the slow that Mark's empire, her future, was slipping through his fingers. Lisa didn't move. She barely breathed. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the humiliation, the fear pressed down on her. But for the first time in months, she felt something else rising beneath it. Power. "Mr. Carter," the judge continued, her tone shifting from neutral to something sterner, more pointed. "This trust legally entitles your spouse to 50% of its assets. Given that these assets include holdings in Carter Enterprises, as well as multiple properties and investment accounts, Mrs. Carter's share is substantial." Lisa's hands gripped the edge of the table as Mark turned to her, his face a mixture of anger and desperation. She had spent years being dismissed, ignored, overlooked. But today, Mark had no choice but to see her. Mark's lawyer cleared his throat, trying to salvage what little ground they had left. "Your Honor, if I may, there must be some way to contest this." But even he didn't sound convinced. The judge gave him a sharp look. "Mr. Carter's attempt to hide assets before the divorce proceedings already raises legal concerns. Given the nature of this trust, any further disputes would require extensive litigation, which I doubt would benefit your client." Mark opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came. His carefully constructed plan was unraveling, thread by thread. He turned to Lisa, his expression shifting from outrage to something more controlled, more familiar. "Lisa," he said, his voice suddenly smooth, the same voice he used when convincing investors, when charming clients, "let's not make this ugly. We can talk about this privately. Come on, we don't have to let lawyers and judges dictate how we handle things." Lisa stared at him, the audacity of his words almost laughable. After everything, after stripping her of their life together, parading his mistress in front of her, leaving her with nothing, he still thought he could manipulate her. Maybe he had assumed she was still the woman who had once loved him enough to trust blindly. But that woman no longer existed. Lisa let the silence stretch between them, letting him squirm in his own desperation. She could see it now, the cracks in his confidence, the realization that he had lost control of the narrative. Mark was used to being in charge, used to people bending to his will. But Lisa wasn't bending anymore. She leaned back in her chair, tilting her head slightly, studying him as if seeing him for the first time. "You're right, Mark," she said finally, her voice even. "We don't have to make this ugly. But we both know you already did." A flicker of something, anger, regret, fear crossed his face. Amanda shifted beside him, arms crossed, jaw tight. Whatever future she had imagined with Mark, it was slipping through her manicured fingers. The judge cleared her throat, pulling the focus back to the front of the room. Given the circumstances, the court rules in favor of Mrs. Carter's entitlement to 50% of the trust's assets. Furthermore, she continued, flipping to another document, Mr. Carter's attempts to conceal assets prior to these proceedings warrant additional penalties. Mrs. Carter will be awarded an additional 10% in compensation for financial misconduct. A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Lisa felt the breath she'd been holding finally release. It wasn't just a victory, it was justice. Mark's head dropped into his hands. Amanda looked away, her expression unreadable, and Lisa, for the first time in a long time, she felt free. Mark exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, his frustration barely contained. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. But it was over. The gavel hadn't even fallen yet, and he already knew it. His empire, the one he had built on Lisa's sacrifices, on her loyalty, on the belief that she would always be the silent supporter in the background, was now crumbling in real time. Amanda, sensing the shift in power, leaned in close to Mark, whispering something harshly into his ear. Lisa didn't need to hear it to know what was happening. The same woman who had smirked at her across the table was now realizing that Mark wasn't the golden ticket she thought he was. Lisa watched the unraveling with quiet satisfaction. She had come into this courtroom expecting defeat, expecting to walk away with nothing. But now, she sat with her back straight, shoulders squared, as the judge prepared to finalize the ruling. She had spent years doubting herself, questioning if she was the problem, if she hadn't been enough. But looking at Mark, now furious, desperate, crumbling under the weight of his own deceit, she finally saw the truth. It had never been about her being enough. It had always been about him taking too much. The judge's gavel finally struck, the sharp sound cutting through the thick silence in the room. This court finds the Financial Trust Division legally binding. The ruling stands. Mrs. Carter is entitled to 50% of the assets, plus an additional 10% as compensation for fraudulent activity. It was done. Just like that, the battle Mark had been so sure he would win had ended in complete and utter defeat. Lisa exhaled slowly, absorbing the finality of it. Across from her, Mark sat frozen, his fingers laced together tightly, his mind likely racing through every possible way. Out there wasn't one. Not this time. Amanda, no longer smug, adjusted her posture, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. The cracks in their relationship, which had been invisible when money seemed endless, were now glaringly obvious. Lisa stood, smoothing her hands over her blouse, as Daniel gathered the necessary paperwork. She could feel Mark's gaze on her, burning with frustration, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of looking back. He had expected her to beg, to fold, to accept whatever scraps he tossed her way, but she had done her begging in private, in the long, sleepless nights, where she had tried to understand why the man she had loved had turned into a stranger. That version of Lisa was gone. She had walked into the courtroom as the discarded wife. She was walking out as something else, entirely someone Mark could no longer control. As Lisa stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, she felt the weight of the past 18 years lift off her shoulders. For months, she had dreaded this day, convinced it would be the moment she lost everything. Instead, she had gained something far more valuable: closure. Behind her, the courthouse doors swung open, and Mark and Amanda emerged, their tense whispers growing into an audible argument. Lisa didn't need to turn around to know what was happening. Amanda hadn't signed up for this. She had latched onto a man who was supposed to be untouchable, wealthy, powerful, but now, stripped of the certainty of his fortune, Mark was just a bitter, aging man with nothing left to offer. The fairy tale Amanda had envisioned was already crumbling before it even began. Daniel walked beside Lisa, tucking his folder under his arm, his expression unreadable. "You did good in there," he finally said. She let out a small laugh, one that still carried remnants of disbelief. "I didn't do anything," she admitted. "You did." He shook his head. "You walked away on your own terms. That's more than most people can say." Lisa let the words sink in. For so long, she had defined herself by her marriage, by the life she had built around Mark, but now, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, she was standing on her own. And instead of fear, she felt something entirely unexpected: freedom. Lisa reached her car but didn't get in right away. She took a moment to just breathe, to let it all settle. The life she had known was gone, but instead of feeling lost, she felt lighter. She had spent so many years being the backbone of someone else's success, molding herself to fit into Mark's world, sacrificing her dreams for his. But now, there was no more his world. There was just her. A clean slate, a future that was hers to shape. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages from friends who had stood by her through everything, offering support when she had felt completely alone. For the first time in a long time, she considered replying with something other than forced optimism. Maybe, for once, she could just say the truth. "I'm okay. Actually, I think I'm more than okay." Behind her, Mark's voice cut through the parking lot, sharp and irritated. "Amanda, don't walk away from me." Lisa turned slightly, just enough to see Amanda storming toward her own car, her heels clicking aggressively against the pavement. The woman who had once smirked at her from across the courtroom now looked furious, betrayed. Lisa didn't need to hear the argument to know how it was going. Amanda had hitched her future to a man who had promised security, but now, with his assets split and his reputation shaken, all he had left were empty words. Lisa had spent years in Mark's shadow, watching him take and take, until there was nothing left. Amanda had assumed she would be different, that she was special. But men like Mark didn't change. They just found new people to use. And Amanda had finally realized she was next in line. Lisa watched as Amanda yanked open her car door, pausing just long enough to fire one last venomous remark at Mark before getting in. Whatever illusion she had clung to was gone now, shattered under the weight of Mark's failure. Lisa knew that feeling all too well, the moment when you realize the person you trusted never actually saw you as an equal, only as something useful. Amanda sped off without looking back, leaving Mark standing alone in the middle of the parking lot, his fists clenched at his sides. For a brief second, Lisa thought he might turn toward her, might try one last time to salvage his dignity. But she didn't care. Not anymore. Mark Carter had spent years building himself up at her expense, and now, as the dust settled, he was the one left standing in the wreckage. Lisa finally got into her car, the engine humming beneath her fingers as she gripped the wheel. There was no sadness, no anger, no regret, just clarity. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, she wasn't waiting on someone else's decisions to shape her life. She had walked into that courtroom thinking she had lost everything, but as she pulled out of the parking lot, leaving Mark and his broken empire behind, she realized the truth. She hadn't lost, she had been set free. As Lisa drove through the city streets, she allowed herself to take in everything with fresh eyes. The same roads she had traveled for years, always rushing to pick up dry cleaning, always hurrying to make it to Mark's meetings on time, always running errands that benefited everyone but herself. Different now, lighter. She didn't have anywhere to be, no one waiting for her to solve their problems. The realization hit her like a gust of fresh air. For the first time in 18 years, her time was hers alone. She glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the exhausted, defeated woman she had been just that morning. But instead, she saw someone new, someone who had survived, someone who was just getting started. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from her best friend, Claire. "Dinner tonight. You need champagne and carbs. Lots of carbs." Lisa let out a reel. Genuine laugh, something she hadn't done in months. She reached for the phone at a red light and typed back quickly, "Absolutely. And I'm picking the restaurant. Expensive and excessive. Mark would hate it." She hit send, grinning to herself. It was such a small thing, an inside joke between friends, but it symbolized so much more. She wasn't just reclaiming her finances, her independence, her dignity. She was reclaiming herself. And that was worth more than anything Mark had ever taken from her. Lisa pulled into the parking lot of her apartment complex, her new home, one that wasn't filled with memories of Mark, of arguments in the kitchen, of nights spent wondering where he was. It was small, it was temporary, but it was hers. She grabbed her purse, stepped out of the car, and took a deep breath, savoring the crisp evening air. For months, she had been drowning, suffocating under the weight of what had been done to her. But now, standing under the glow of the streetlights, she felt something she hadn't in years: hope. Mark had spent years trying to make her believe she was nothing without him. And yet, here she was, standing taller, breathing easier, and finally, free. As she made her way inside, she let herself imagine the future, a future that belonged to her and no one else. Maybe she'd travel. Maybe she'd go back to school. Maybe she'd start her own business, one that didn't require sacrificing her soul for someone else's success. The possibilities stretched out before her, endless and exciting. And as she shut the door behind her, leaving the past exactly where it belonged, she smiled to herself. Lisa Carter had been the woman behind the man for 18 years. But now, she was the woman in front.